Writing lists was relatively easy. We just iterated over the list, writing each line to a file, just the same way we would print it. We even used the same function, the print function. The reason this was easy was that we knew in advance how many items in the list there were. However, that presents a challenge for reading from a list. When we're reading, we don't know in advance how many lines there are to read. So how do we get around this? Well, one way is we could actually go back and change what we output, and we could first write the number of lines to expect to the file, and so the first thing we would read is the number of lines to expect, then we would run a loop for that many lines, but that's complicated. We don't want to do that. Instead, Python has a mechanism for reading all the lines in a file until we reach the end of the file. We actually do this with the same for each syntax that we've used in the past. So the value of input file when we read from a file using that open function is really like a list of strings. And so we can iterate over it the same way we iterate over any list of strings. We simply say, for each line in the file that we've loaded, and then one by one, the lines from the file become the lines for this loop. When we reach the end of the file, then the loop has no more lines, then the loop is done. So here, we're very simply running a for loop for each line in the file, and each line is appended to the list, my list of names. We started off blank because we haven't loaded any names yet, but one by one, we load the name and append it to our list. So here we show if we run that kind of load on our file of integers. It would actually create a list and load each integer into that list one by one. In theory, we could also write our load function for our integers differently and instead load them into a list and then unpack them into our variables like myInt1 and myInt2, using the same unpacking syntax that we saw in our chapter on lists. And just as before, we can merge loading individual variables with loading a list. Here, we know to expect 3 integers at the beginning of our file, so we load them one by one each time we call inputFile.readLine. Then after that, inputFile is down at the end of those 3 integers. So when we run for line in inputFile, it's already skipped the first 3 lines. So if we append each line one by one to my list, then it's only going to append the remaining lines from that file. So at the end of this code, the status of all our variables, both the myInt variables and the list, are the same as when we saved previously. Now note also that we don't have to read line by line. There's also a method that will just read the entire contents of the file and put it into one string. That's just the read method, and sometimes that might be useful as well.